Stalin, consigned to what his old enemy Trotsky called the dustbin of history. He's in good company. Brezhnev is in disgrace. Even Lenin is no longer the hero he was. Leaders who ruled 100 Soviet nationalities, gathering dust in the cellars of a Moscow museum. Will Mikhail Gorbachev end up here too? I don't know. I do know that a bloody and extraordinary history has touched every one of his millions of subjects. It happened to them one at a time, and one at a time is how they are going to tell their country's story.
This is where the old communists come, to end their days in peace. The retirement home at Peredelkino near Moscow is their reward for at least half a century of loyal service to the party. They've survived revolution, terror, war, and perestroika. Their numbers are dwindling, but there are still some who remember what Russia was like before the revolution they made changed the world. Moisei Muravnik is 99 years old and a lifelong revolutionary. He was already a grown man when the old order was swept away, when he and people like him brought down the last Tsar of all the Russias. Nicholas II, the last Romanov, married one of Queen Victoria's 40 grandchildren. Their happy union produced 4 daughters and a son. Moisei Muravnik was one of 20 children from Belorussia. The Muravniks were Jews. They took the train east to escape persecution. The Trans-Siberian Railway had opened up the heart of the empire. It brought the Muravniks 3,000 miles to the gold fields along the river Lena. Siberian gold miners worked in temperatures which could fall to -60. Their lives were hard and dangerous. In 1912, they went on strike. They asked for more money, an 8-hour day, and an education for their children.
We all got together from the mines, collected in one place around the Nadezhensk mine, and off we marched. It was peaceful, really peaceful. Nobody suspected a thing. So when the shooting started, it took us completely by surprise. Well, you know, we had 500 workers killed or wounded that day. I can still picture it. The snow still hadn't melted, and there were bodies lying around on the ground. Women and children crying over them. It was, well, it was terrible. I can't forget it. It was the first time I'd ever seen anyone get shot. Never seen anything like that. It opened our eyes.
The strike went on. We asked for bread, you gave us bullets. Long live the right to strike. Shame on the butchers. As the Siberian families buried their dead, 500,000 workers went on sympathy strike in every corner of the empire. The Tsar's Minister of the Interior defended the shooting. He said, "It has happened and it will happen again." The Imperial Parliament was not impressed and voted to set up its own inquiry. At the time of the Lena Goldfield massacre, the Crown Prince Tsarevich Alexei was 8 years old. He was very frail. From his great-grandmother Queen Victoria, he had inherited haemophilia. That autumn, he started to bleed internally. His doctors could do nothing to help him. A Siberian holy man called Rasputin sent Alexandra a telegram. "The little one will not die," he said. "Don't allow the doctors to bother him too much." The crisis passed. The Empress came to rely on Rasputin to help her son. Whenever he was well enough, the little boy accompanied his father on affairs of state. They were filmed together at the celebrations marking the Tsar's 25th year as an army officer. But the serious nature of the child's illness was kept a closely guarded secret. In those last few years of peace, before the Great War engulfed the old order, the Romanovs ruled a country which was modernizing fast. The Russian people had political parties, trade unions, a relatively free press, and an economic boom. So in the summer of 1913, it was a prosperous and self-confident city of Moscow which prepared to mark 300 years of Romanov rule. There were hundreds of Muscovites lined up on Pushkin Square that summer too. They came here out of curiosity to see whether reputation would match up to reality. They came to see the Tsar.
That was the year the Tsar and Tsarina came to Moscow. I was still at school then, just a little boy, 12 years old, and I decided to come along here and meet the Tsar. There were crowds of people about. This street here was lined with policemen, and they weren't letting anybody onto the road. You know, I was only a small boy, so I climbed up into a tree. There used to be a tree just over there. I had a grand view of the Tsar and Tsarina parading by. I could see them bowing to the right and to the left, just like this. They gave a bow in my direction, too, and I gave them a wave back. And that was the end of that.
The watching crowds were less than friendly towards the imperial family. A scandal was brewing. Compromising letters from the Empress to Rasputin had been leaked. "All I want is to sleep, sleep forever on your shoulder, in your embrace," she wrote.
My feelings were quite fierce, really. The Tsar seemed far away. He was the highest of the high, and we were the lowest of the low.
August 1914, Winter Palace Square, St. Petersburg. Patriotic fervor as the Tsar announced war with Germany. Hostility towards him vanished. The French ambassador said, to those thousands, the Tsar really was the autocrat, the absolute master of their bodies and souls. Rasputin wrote to the Tsar imploring him to stay out of the war. "Dear friend, again I say a terrible storm cloud hangs over Russia. Disaster, grief, murky darkness and no light. A whole ocean of tears, there is no counting them, and so much blood." All over Europe, men marched off in the biggest mobilization the world had ever seen. Nicholas appointed his uncle, Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, Commander-in-Chief of the Russian Armed Forces. All armies fought with God on their side. But there had been no war between the great powers since 1871. Nobody foresaw what this war would be like. The first Russian men marched off with their heads held high, but the army had 1 million more men than rifles. The old soldiers at the Communist Party rest home were lucky to survive. In the first year alone, 4 million Russian soldiers were sacrificed.
We fought for the Tsar. Well, that's what it looked like. But really, we were fighting to get the Germans off our backs. Your country is your country, no matter whether there's a Tsar up there or whoever. So that's why we fought. We fought for our country.
At the front, conditions were very difficult. I ended up having to spend the autumn, winter, and then the spring there. We had a hard time of it in the Carpathian Mountains. Our clothes were really light. We only had summer boots to wear. There weren't any winter boots to be had. And there weren't any trenches either to dig ourselves in, because the ground there was too rocky. We ended up sitting in the snow.
Rations were bad, and there was nothing of them. And the soldiers just went hungry. The soldiers had to eat all together, 8 at a time, and all off one plate. In fact, soldiers had no rights at all. We weren't allowed into the parks or gardens. You weren't allowed to take your dog in, and soldiers couldn't walk around in there either. It was written up above the entrance, no soldiers, no dogs.
Men treated like dogs died like dogs. The German commander was General Paul von Hindenburg. He said in the Great War Ledger, the page on which the Russian losses were written has been torn out. All we know is that sometimes in our battles with the Russians, we had to remove the mounds of enemy corpses from before our trenches in order to get a clear field of fire against fresh assaulting waves. In 1915, the Tsar decided to take personal control of the conduct of his disastrous war. He sacked his uncle Nikolai Nikolaevich and appointed himself commander-in-chief. It was brave, conscientious, and foolish. It meant he would be blamed for everything that went wrong. And discontent mounted with the casualty figures.
Some of the soldiers, the ones from a working-class background, were already in the mood for revolution, without a doubt. We got discussions organized. I told them all about Siberia and all about that strike we had, why we went on strike, all that kind of thing.
2,000 miles from the front line at the far end of the Golden Road to Samarkand, Soviet Uzbekistan. Mansour Safarov was there on the day in the summer of 1916 when the town of Zhizak refused to fight. The Muslims of Central Asia were called up and their livestock requisitioned by a Russian government desperate to replace its appalling losses.
People said, we're not giving them anything, and we're not going. So we started this revolution. We wanted freedom. We said, this is our town, and we're not going to be called up by Tsar Nicholas. Oh, and then the soldiers crowded in. They'd been sent from Russia by Nicholas, and they killed everyone. They killed everyone they saw. They just shot everybody. They even killed women. I saw one. They tore her clothes off her and stabbed her bare body. They even took the women's daughters away.
Thousands died in the prolonged and bloody suppression of the Asian Rising. In European Russia, the winter of 1916 closed in. It was even colder than usual. Tempers were short, and the government held in contempt. A wave of strikes paralyzed the capital. There was no heating fuel, and bread was rationed. St. Petersburg had been renamed Petrograd to make it sound less German. But with the Tsar away at the front, Rasputin seemed to be in charge, alongside a Tsarina who was born in Germany. Opposition cartoons depicted him as a drunk and a lecher. a sinister puppet master ruling Russia through a cuckold and a German whore. 3 right-wing aristocrats took action. They killed Rasputin and drove down to the river Neva with a body in the boot of their Rolls-Royce. The historian Robert Conquest has spent half a lifetime studying everything that happened next.
They threw Rasputin's trussed-up body into the river here, after they'd poisoned him, stabbed him, and shot him. Even so, some think he was still alive when he hit the water. His assassins were acclaimed as heroes and patriots. The new year, 1917, dawned a few days later. 1917 was the year the old Russian Empire took a step into the unknown, a year of revolution and experiment which transformed this country. It presented a dream of freedom and equality which has haunted the history of our century. What happened to this dream is the theme of this series.
Down with the old regime, the banners said. Women workers and soldiers' wives led the first demonstrations. By the third day, 250,000 people were on strike in the capital. A small boy from a socialist family made his way to the city center.
It was full of people discussing and shouting, we want food, we want bread. The feeling was rather tense because in the corner of the square near the station, there was a detachment of mounted gendarmes, a political police. And nobody knew what was going to happen, of course. And then suddenly we heard shouting that the Cossacks are coming. In such circumstances, there would be a feeling of panic, because Cossacks were even more feared than gendarmes. But to our surprise, on the contrary, the shouting seemed to be quite joyful, cheerful. In fact, they were cheering the Cossacks. That was something quite unexpected. Meanwhile, gendarmes, it seems, were just as much surprised as the crowd was. I remember very clearly a very big man, a worker, grasped the tail of the horse on which the officer sat and pulled it so wildly down that the horse practically sat on the haunches. And that made it easier for the crowd to pull the officer down. And he was disarmed, and his sword was broken, and all the other gendarmes were disarmed, and funnily enough, nothing happened to them. They were allowed to go.
Not all figures of authority were spared. This is the Volinsky Regiment. On the 27th of February, they refused orders to move against the crowds. They shot their commanding officer and went over to the revolution. And at the naval base of Kronstadt, Philip Musatov saw an officer lynched.
I didn't just watch it. I took part in the whole thing. I was there. At Kronstadt, there was this admiral. He was commander of the whole fleet. We got him unprepared in square. We bayoneted him. We killed him. Of course, it was hard. I think even when you're faced with killing your worst enemy, it's the same thing. You can feel it's wrong. It was the same then, but what can you do? At the time, the situation was such that we didn't even think about it. It was just, come on, finish him off, kill him.
The chief of the Petrograd military district telegraphed the Tsar. He reported the whole city in the hands of the revolutionists and all the government ministers arrested. The Tsar never got back to Petrograd. Railway workers stopped his train 170 miles away. He abdicated in a siding. A dignified illustration appeared in the London Graphic magazine. A Russian cartoon showed the Tsar taking his double-headed pet home. Let's see how they manage without the eagle. All around me treason, cowardice, deceit, he wrote. The protector of the ancient Orthodox Church was deposed with barely a murmur of protest. This revolution was unanimous. Father Alexander Trofimov, now in exile in Paris, was then an officer cadet.
We even went marching around with red flags and drums, rejoicing at it all, because the Bolsheviks were saying that now we are free and everything's going to be wonderful. And we all believed it too. During those first few days of the February Revolution, later, when we saw how they were attacking and arresting people, that was when we changed our minds. But at first we even went parading around the town with trumpets and an orchestra. The revolution was something we were all part of.
Margot Tracy's family were wealthy capitalists who ran a brewing empire. They welcomed the revolution too.
Everybody was fed up with the Tsar because they thought he was weak. And when the Tsar actually abdicated, there was great rejoicement everywhere. And I remember my parents opened champagne bottles and celebrated it with friends. Everybody was very pleased because they never expected anything to get worse. They thought everything was going to be better because he was much criticized. There were lots of scandals at court. And so everybody thought things were for the better.
Even the circus joined the party as the streets of Petrograd erupted in celebration. Posses of revolutionaries roamed around, striking attitudes for the newsreel cameramen. They saw themselves as the heirs of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity. But there was one sad duty to perform. The violence had claimed almost 2,000 lives, and the solemn funeral of the fighters for freedom was the first great state occasion of revolutionary Russia. Thousands of ordinary people and dignitaries from all political parties came to pay their respects. The mourners included the ministers of the new administration. They called it the Provisional Government. It was to hold the fort only until a proper general election. The martyrs of the revolution were to be vindicated by the election of a real parliament. The dream was a constituent assembly representing all democratic Russia. The provisional government set up shop in one wing of the Tauride Palace and passed some revolutionary decrees, dismantling the Tsarist police, abolishing capital punishment. But in the opposite wing of the same palace was another new political organization. It was a council called the Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies, directly elected from barracks and factories.
Here in the Tauride Palace, the Soviet drew up its Order Number 1 to the Petrograd garrison. In particular, standing to attention and obligatory saluting off-duty shall be cancelled. Likewise, officers shall be addressed as Mr. General, Mr. Colonel, etc., instead of Your Excellency. Rudeness towards soldiers of all ranks shall be forbidden. Thus did the much put upon soldiers get their reward for making the February Revolution possible.
Army officers came to the Tauride Palace to commit themselves to fighting on for revolutionary Russia against the German armies. The response of the soldiers at the front line was quite different.
After the February Revolution, the army just completely fell apart. Soldiers sat themselves up on the train roofs with their ration books. The officers didn't allow them up on the roofs, but they didn't obey orders. Everyone just wanted to get home as quickly as possible.
In the capital, the cry was still, "War till victory." Demonstrating soldiers sent greetings to their comrades in the trenches, and they proclaimed, "Long live the Soviet," and "Long live the provisional government." But which of the two was really going to run the city? One man came forward to take a place on both organizations. Deputy chairman of the Soviet and Minister of Justice in the provisional government was a young lawyer called Alexander Kerensky. Years later, he said, between February and October, the revolution became a flood, and we could neither halt nor direct it. The old cruiser Aurora is long past her fighting days, but she is honored every year on the anniversary of the October Revolution. The Aurora is a symbol of the victory of communism, centerpiece of Admiral Suslov's anniversary review of the Baltic Fleet in Leningrad. The Baltic sailors were the stormtroopers of the Second Russian Revolution of 1917. The pride and beauty of the revolution, Lenin called them. Every year, the naval officers invite elderly Bolsheviks to their anniversary party to share the celebration and pass on their revolutionary memories. Mikhail Sinazyorsky was there on the day in April 1917 when the exiled leader of a tiny Marxist party stepped off a train and changed the lives of everyone round this table. It was Easter Monday. The Finland station, Petrograd.
It was a lovely sunny day. Us kids were hanging about on the street when we saw them. They were walking slowly along and turning from side to side to show off this placard to the crowds on the pavement. The sunshine had brought everyone out into the streets. They must have used tooth powder to write their placards. It was dripping everywhere, and what it said was this: "Comrades!" exclamation mark. Arriving at the Finland station today, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, in brackets, Lenin. Come and meet him.
Lenin was a clever man, much the toughest of all the exiled professional revolutionaries. It was the Germans who sent him home. They were hoping he'd make trouble. A friend said he had eyes like steel shavings.
None of us had any idea what Lenin would look like, because he'd gone abroad in 1907. He had on this spring coat. He had a beard and a moustache, and he was bald, of course. And there he was, Lenin. There were masses of people there, and a couple of men leapt out of the crowd. They got hold of Vladimir Ilyich, picked him up, and helped him onto the turret of that armoured car, that one over there. And right away he started to speak. He said that we must go onward, our weapons in our hands, onto the socialist revolution. And he finished up with, "Long live the socialist revolution."
Lenin was the only man in Russia who thought his country was ready for socialism. But in the excitement of revolution, political ideas were changing fast. The entire city had become a mass meeting. In May, local council elections brought everyone into the streets. There was a bewildering choice of parties. Each was identified by a number to help the semi-literate voters to cope. On the far left, the Bolshevik wing of the Russian Social Democratic Party did well. Lenin's slogans were simple and compelling, especially for soldiers sick of the war.
I remember them bringing this soldier up to the platform, and someone saying, "Go on then, speak up." And he said, "All right." Well, up until then, every soldier who had made a speech had started it, "Gentlemen." But this soldier, when he gave his speech, he said, "Comrades." There was a bit of a pause, and then he says, "Let's get it right. What are we doing calling each other gentlemen?" he says. And he points at this group of officers. "There's your gentlemen. And you know, comrades, who the Bolsheviks are?" Well, a chorus of soldiers replied, "No, no idea. The Bolsheviks demand an end to this bloody war that's no use to anyone. Or don't tell me you want it to continue." So once again, a chorus of soldiers. "Down with the war. Long live the Bolsheviks." From that day on, I called myself a Bolshevik. I was a real Bolshevik. But Bolshevism, I didn't have a clue what that was all about.
There was a Bolshevik in charge here at the huge Putilov arms factory. The workers elected him to replace the director they'd killed in February. But the party of the proletariat had never been open to every worker. Lenin wanted dedicated, full-time revolutionaries who would give their lives to leading the working class from the front. Bolshevik successes meant trouble for Alexander Kerensky and the provisional government. Kerensky traveled the front to rally the troops. "Can't you suffer any longer?" he asked. "Or has free Russia become steadily a nation of revolted slaves?" Kerensky approved the organization of a women's death battalion, hoping the image of their shaven heads would shame Russian men into fighting. 1,500 women joined up in one evening, and Emmeline Pankhurst, the British suffragette, paid the battalion an admiring visit. In June, Kerensky launched Russia's summer offensive against Germany. It was an embarrassing flop. The soldiers were interested in revolution, not fighting. The head of the British military mission to Russia said the Russian army was irretrievably ruined as a fighting organization. Once again, anti-war protests brought the capital to a standstill. Now there were 500,000 people on the streets. Banners attacked the provisional government and called for immediate peace. The city was full of deserters. The mood was tense and ugly. July, a fumbling attempt by the Bolsheviks to seize power was put down by troops sent by the Soviet. Kerensky wired from the front, "Arrest the enemies of the people and counter-revolutionaries." Lenin shaved off his beard and fled the city on false papers. Scandal broke over the heads of his comrades.
Sometimes the arguments got so heated they ended up in fisticuffs. Children fighting. They'd be shouting, "You're following Lenin, and Lenin's a German spy. The Germans have bought him for money. They sent him back to Russia on purpose. He's a traitor to Russia, and you're following a man like that. Someone who can only bring unhappiness to Russia."
Lenin took refuge at Razliv, in the woods on the Gulf of Finland, 20 miles outside Petrograd. The straw hut where he hid is now a Soviet shrine.
Lenin spent most of the summer writing a book, State and Revolution, and sending a series of ferocious letters to his comrades, demanding that they stop shilly-shallying and get on with organizing the socialist insurrection. They ignored his letters. He threatened to resign. This went on all summer. Lenin never got round to finishing his book. As he said, "It is more pleasant and useful to go through the experience of the revolution than to write about it."
August. Factories were closing, wages were falling, inflation was spiraling out of control. The army had a new commander-in-chief, General Kornilov. 2 million men had deserted from the front, and he blamed the left. "If necessary, we'll hang every member of the Soviet," he said, and attempted a military coup. The coup was a dismal failure. It left the general's political boss, Kerensky, dangerously isolated. Some thought he should have supported Kornilov. Everyone else thought he'd betrayed the revolution. Leon Trotsky was the beneficiary. For years a supporter of the more cautious Menshevik tendency, Trotsky joined the Bolsheviks and was elected chairman of the Petrograd Soviet. They called it dual power, but that was never a true reflection of the uneasy relationship between the provisional government and the Soviet. The Soviet had all the real power in the city. Now it had a Bolshevik majority, a Bolshevik chairman, and a Bolshevik slogan: all power to the Soviets.
This flat belonged to a prominent Menshevik called Sukhanov, whose wife was a Bolshevik sympathizer. On the night of October the 10th, when her husband was out, she invited Lenin and his Central Committee to meet here. This was the night his comrades finally fell into line behind Lenin, the night they drew up the plan for armed insurrection in the name of Soviet power. Mrs. Sukhanov made them tea and sausage sandwiches.
This is the way the Russians remember the October Revolution. This heroic reconstruction was a piece of street theatre filmed to celebrate a revolutionary anniversary. The truth was less dramatic. The rising began not at the Winter Palace, but at the city post office and telephone exchange, captured by a band of red sailors.
The post office and telegraph were being guarded by officer cadets, supporters of the provisional government. We disarmed them. Well, there were more of us than them. There must have been 800 of us and maybe 300 of them. So we disarmed them and kicked them out. And we cut off the telephone lines to the provisional government where they were meeting in the Winter Palace. Then I went off to the Winter Palace with a small unit, about 25 men. The Winter Palace was heavily defended. At all the windows everywhere, there were sandbags. And behind these barricades, there was a guard of Tsar's cadets, armed with rifles and machine guns. There was one point defended by the Women's Death Battalion, the most vulnerable spot, the only place that we could take. We thought if we went into the attack all shouting, "Hurrah!" they wouldn't shoot at us. Then we would somehow scramble past their defences and get into the Winter Palace that way. It didn't work out. They fired a hail of bullets at us.
Defended by the last of the women and cadets, the provisional government sat inside the Winter Palace and waited for the end. The last Minister of Justice described the scene. Doomed people, lonely, abandoned by all, walked around in the huge mousetrap. The red cruiser Aurora stood hard by, her guns trained on the palace. The Bolsheviks had picked the day of their insurrection carefully. At the Smolny Institute, delegates from Soviets all over Russia were arriving for a national congress. Amid heated discussions, the delegates heard the Aurora open fire, the signal for a last assault. The storming of the Winter Palace. In reality, it was dark. It was foggy. There were no film cameras. There was hardly any resistance. 5 soldiers and 1 sailor died.
I got to the palace a bit later. There were big cellars under there, flooded with water because of all the bombardment. They kept a lot of wine down there. Old wine, 50, 60 years old. Our sailor lads, they'd got into the cellars and were going along the wine racks. They'd pick out a bottle, smash the top off, have a taste and say, "Oh, that's no good." And this wine was 50 years old.
The party went on for days. Finally, what was left in the cellars was pumped into the river. At the Smolny, Lenin and Trotsky heard the news that their attack had succeeded. But delegates to the Congress of Soviets had been arguing all night about whether they even wanted the Bolsheviks to seize power in their name. Lenin walked into the great white ballroom to make his announcement.
By 10 in the morning, most of the delegates who opposed the coup had given up and left. So Lenin was greeted by tumultuous applause when he told the Congress, "We will now proceed to construct the socialist order." And that was the revolution in Petrograd. Even Trotsky felt it was a little unexciting.
In Moscow, Soviet power was not so easily won. There were 7 days of pitched battles as officers struggled to defend February against October.
We fought the Bolshevik government. Our attack began successfully enough. We formed up into lines and rushed the Kremlin and burst through. Some of our men were already dead and wounded by then. But still, we took the Kremlin and hung on to it for several days. Then we had to abandon it. The Reds began to overwhelm us. Big reinforcements came from Petersburg. These troops who came from Petersburg, they believed in the Bolsheviks. They were dedicated to the Bolsheviks. They had already taken the Winter Palace in Petersburg. And then they threw everything they had into Moscow to crush our rebellion.
By the time the fighting was over, 500 men and women lay dead. The Kremlin had passed into the control of the Red Guards, including Nikolai Smirnov, the boy who waved at the Tsar, and his young friend Leonid Orlovsky.
The battle lasted 7 days and 7 nights. But our enthusiasm was so great. More and more people kept coming across to join us. Well, people were killed. People were wounded. Of course I was afraid for my life. I tried not to get in the way of the bullets, tried to stay alive. We knew we were going to our deaths because we were making a revolution. And the older workers did look after me.
I went around all the morgues in the city of Moscow looking for people I knew. And I found my uncle. He'd been killed on one of the streets in Moscow. He was an ordinary tram conductor. And I found him. The interesting thing is that he still had his watch, his money, his wallet. He hadn't lost anything, do you understand? And I thought, well, we all thought, all my family, what a conscience folk have, that no one's robbed any of these poor dead people.
Muscovites emerged to find their cities shell-shocked. The surviving whites were disarmed and allowed to leave. Red and white, Moscow buried its dead in separate graves. Among those who attended the white funeral was a student, Militsa Zernov.
So when this fight in the streets was over, I went to the university and found all the bodies of those who were fighting them. I was telling goodbye to them on behalf of the mothers and sisters and fiancés, and took part in the funeral. And that was a colossal manifestation of an old Russia. The communists had no time yet to organize any resistance, so the funeral was quite free. We went through the streets of Moscow to the cemetery, and that was an old Russia saying goodbye to its sons.
The Red Guards who survived got together on Red Square. We dug a huge pit by the walls to bury the martyrs of the revolution. These days, Red Square looks beautiful all round the Kremlin walls. But then it was just a great big pit. People brought coffins here from all over Moscow. Some of the coffins weren't painted at all, just bare planks. We laid the coffins one on top of the other, and that's how we buried them. We had no orchestra, we had no ceremony. We just buried our dead comrades and sang revolutionary songs.
In Petrograd, the Smolny was now headquarters to Lenin's revolutionary Soviet government. The soldiers had been promised peace and land, and the Bolsheviks were as good as their word. The Great War was still going on. Trotsky went off to negotiate peace with the Germans for his army of peasants in uniform. The soldiers' families had spent the summer taking land from their landlords by force. The Bolsheviks legalized the seizures.
About that time, this former Bolshevik came back to our village. He'd been in exile. He got all us young people together and he said, "Right, lads, the Bolshevik Party has got a slogan. Shake the crows out of their nests." And what it means, he explained, what it means is we're going to take the land away from the landowners. The first thing we did was to get a group together. Must have been 50 of us. Well, when we got to this landowner's estate, it was burning. Someone had set fire to it. All the cattle were let out. People took a calf or a horse, whatever they could lay their hands on. I didn't take anything. Somehow I just couldn't bring myself to steal.
One week after the Bolsheviks seized power, the election for the Constituent Assembly went ahead as planned. This was the parliament in whose name the February Revolution had overthrown the Tsar. A peasant party called the Socialist Revolutionaries expected to win a majority. 40 million people cast their votes, only a quarter of them for the Bolsheviks. The Constituent Assembly met in the Tauride Palace. The Peasants' Party had indeed won a majority of the 800 seats, but their organization was hopelessly split. It was all too late.
Red sailors stood in the balcony, their guns trained on the delegates below. After a few hours of barracking, they lost patience. "That's enough of that," they said, and closed the assembly down. It was an undignified end to the dreams of a generation of revolutionary Democrats. The Bolsheviks had ridden roughshod over the votes of millions. Russia's infant parliament had lasted just one day.
Soviet power spread quickly as red units traveled the empire. They reached Kazakhstan, close to the Chinese border.
One day, about 20 soldiers just turned up in our village, Bolshevik soldiers. The elders were pleased. "Ah," they said, "so we're going to have a Soviet government. They'll help our poor people, our orphans and our old folks. We're all going to enjoy a long life. There is no better government than the Soviet government. The Soviet government will be honest and just."
A dream of peace and prosperity. But a small urban workers' party had taken charge of a vast rural peasant state. The Tsar had reigned over 100 different nationalities. A bloody civil war lay ahead to secure the horizons of the Soviet Empire. The international emblem of workers' power burned by a people for whom the red flag is a symbol of Russian imperialism. Tbilisi is the ancient capital of the mountainous Soviet Republic of Georgia. This was a colony which hoped to benefit from the revolution in Russia. Independence Day for Georgia came on the 26th of May, 1918.
Of course, I rushed to the town centre straight away, caught my breath and looked around. The whole town had spilled out into the streets. Everybody had heard that today was the day they were to declare Georgia independent. The streets were teeming with people. Children were running everywhere, singing, playing games. It was such a celebration. We'd got our independence back at last.
In May 1919, independent Georgia celebrated the first anniversary of the national government. Their freedom was short-lived. Sergo Orjonikidze was a Georgian. He was also a Bolshevik. In 1921, he brought communism to Georgia at gunpoint. Orjonikidze marched into his homeland on the orders of another Georgian, the Bolshevik Commissar for Nationalities, Joseph Stalin. Summer 1918, 8 months since the Bolsheviks seized power, a Congress of Soviets met at the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow. The proceedings were interrupted by the Socialist Revolutionary Party attempting a coup. The coup defeated, delegates returned to approve the formation of the Russian Soviet Socialist Federative Republic. An emblem was proposed, hammer, sickle and sword, for workers, peasants and soldiers. Lenin rejected it, too warlike. Congress chose a plain hammer and sickle, a symbol of unity for a state which was far from secure.
The government were finding life rather difficult. The civil servants and teachers wouldn't work with them. The bank clerks went on strike. Lenin sent a telegram to Sweden. Urgently find and send 3 highly skilled accountants to work on reform of the banks. But it was the treaty with the Germans which made people really angry.
The German army took control of the Ukrainian capital of Kiev. The Bolsheviks had kept their promise to pull Russia out of the First World War, but the Germans exacted a ferocious price in losses of territory. To many Russian patriots, the Treaty of 1918 was a terrible humiliation. The River Don, South Russia. This is where the Cossacks come from. The village of Starocherkassk was built by people who fled south hundreds of years ago to escape persecution or to flee the law. The Cossacks served as the elite mounted troops of all the Romanov Tsars. They were legendary for their valor, cruelty, horsemanship, and music. The Don Cossacks were among the first to mount an organized military resistance to Soviet power.
We were shocked. We couldn't understand how Russia could live if there was no Tsar. We found material in a military store and leather to make boots, and we all became shoemakers. We were very well dressed. Crimson caps we had, red on top with a blue band. Crimson caps. And the letter D for Dostoevsky. That was our newly formed Russian fighting force. The counter-revolution had begun.
Leon Trotsky got the job of countering the counter-revolution. As Commissar for War, Trotsky began to recruit a new kind of army. It was called the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army.
When we created the Red Army, we didn't have any commanders of our own. There were non-commissioned officers, those in charge of small units, but proper trained officers we just didn't have any, and no time to wait. Naturally, the senior officers we did have were as a rule the sons of noblemen or of the bourgeoisie. They had their own ideas, not in tune with Soviet power. So when we invited officers to join us, we simultaneously established a system of control over them. The Commissar's orders were to keep an eye on them, to help them, of course, and to try to learn something from them. In the party, we used to say that the Commissar is the eyes and the ears of the party inside the Red Army.
Inside the party, employing officers from the old Imperial Army was highly controversial. The Red Army did away with the title officer. Senior men were called commanders instead. This was an unconventional army. Trotsky's men received watches instead of medals. The new Red Army was preparing to face civil war.
Right from the start of the Civil War, 1918, they killed all the officers they took prisoner. They shot some of them, took a revolver and just shot them, finished them off. Or they nailed epaulettes into men with nails this size. Or they cut their medals off them, gouged out their chests. I saw a man left dead like that myself. I saw officers who'd been hung on a windmill. You know those windmills that go round and round? They were just hanging there.
The whites were equally merciless. These white guards were filmed in charge of Bolshevik prisoners. Seven million people would die in 3 years of civil war. Into all this came a foreign intervention. At the great Russian ports from Murmansk to Vladivostok, anti-Bolshevik forces put ashore. There was still a world war on. Russia's former allies were furious with the Bolsheviks for pulling out of the conflict. Troops came from America, France, Italy, Japan, and Britain. The British sent a force to Azerbaijan in the south, hoping to safeguard the oil fields and ports of the Black Sea and the Caspian. In Moscow, Lenin and the Bolsheviks were trying to hold together a new and inexperienced government, trying to run the country in accordance with their revolutionary ideals. They sent agitation trains thousands of miles to spread the word about their policies: nationalization, freer divorce, workers' power. They brought the alphabet up to date and promised a mass literacy campaign. And they changed their name from Bolshevik to Communist. Then suddenly they lost the trains. The entire Trans-Siberian Railway fell to a legion of hostile Czechoslovaks. The Czechs fell in with the whites, and the enemy came dangerously close to the town of Ekaterinburg. Too close to its valuable prisoners, the Tsar had been in Bolshevik custody for more than a year. Now, Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children were held in Ekaterinburg, inside the House of Special Purpose. They were taken into the cellar and shot.
Well, the assassination of the Tsar passed practically unnoticed. There were so many other things, and nobody, news was so confused. You know how they how they don't give you news now. I mean, it was all, you never saw anything in the papers about it. It was just rumors. We didn't know for sure whether he'd been assassinated or not. And anyway, there were other things people worried about. The main one, of course, to get food and so on. So it passed unnoticed practically.
Lenin was the target of an assassin's bullet that summer too, victim of a terrorist campaign. This film is possibly the world's first ever political photo opportunity, organized to prove that Lenin had survived.
Suddenly we heard that Lenin had been shot by a terrorist and that he was badly wounded. They brought him to the Kremlin, where we were on guard at the time. How do you think we all felt? It was our job to guard Lenin, and suddenly he's been seriously wounded.
The would-be assassin was Fania Kaplan, a socialist revolutionary. Her party's campaign resulted in several communist funerals. Death to the bourgeoisie, mourners demanded, and revenge in the form of the Red Terror.
There was no sentimentality about the Red Terror. We were to go as far as shooting our enemies, killing all those who opposed Soviet power. And so we killed them. The whole operation was very well organized by the Extraordinary Commission.
The statue is of Felix Dzerzhinsky, founder of the Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution, Speculation and Sabotage, the Cheka, Hammer of the Revolution, he called it. The first Soviet secret police set up in the Anker and Lloyd's Insurance Building in Lubyanka Square. In their first 4 years, they announced 12,733 executions. They're still here today, but now they're called the KGB.
The threat to Soviet power from the new White armies began to overshadow domestic problems. Equipped by the Allies, manned by volunteers and conscripts, the Whites were ready to fight.
We'd run on 100 meters and then drop. The nearer you got, the fiercer the firing from the Bolsheviks. You go on already so close, and then the command rings out, line up, forward. And that's the point. You feel so heavy, you can't raise your head, can't lift a finger. But in the end, we'd get there and smash the Bolsheviks.
Trotsky's army was no easy target. He ran it with an iron discipline from his mobile headquarters aboard a specially equipped train. In the course of the war, Trotsky's train covered 60,000 miles as he traveled the distant fronts, whipping up morale. The men who fought in the Red Army were expected to buy their own food from villagers. It wasn't easy.
Nobody wanted our money in the countryside. They all wanted money issued under the Tsar. In case the Tsar came back, then they'd have the right money. We got supplies in the end. We'd get a supply of salted herrings, but no bread to go with it. So we'd have to eat salted herrings on their own. You soon get thirsty. You lie down by a puddle to drink, and there's a little frog sitting there, staring at you.
Away from the front line, communist propaganda pushed home the message. This cartoon was shown in makeshift cinemas. Posters depicted Lenin sweeping the world clean of class enemies. Trotsky as a red St. George exterminating the dragon of counter-revolution. Communism, a red wedge driving into victory over the forces of white reaction.
Reds versus whites in an ideological fight to the finish? Well, it may have looked like that to the top ranks, but these were hungry and desperate years. Men fought for whoever would feed them. Whole units changed sides, from red to white and back again, or even set up on their own. It was a time of chaos and misery.
The roads of Russia were clogged with refugees driven from their homes, families split up, children who'd lost their parents. The job of looking after them fell to the communist women's section.
And all the women from the women's brigade, we had to feed them, wash them, delouse them. Discipline in the party at the time was very strict. It was a revolutionary discipline. We called anybody who grumbled spoilers. The others, people who didn't agree with Soviet power, who couldn't adjust, we snubbed them, shouted at them for not believing. You see, you had to believe in the shining future the Bolsheviks were leading us to.
In that cruel year of 1919, the shining future seemed very distant. As Lenin buried his brother-in-law, hope of revolution elsewhere in Europe was dying. The Russian Revolution appeared isolated and vulnerable. The Whites had their headquarters far to the east along the Trans-Siberian Railway. They looked effective, organized, and highly menacing, but appearances were deceptive. Even as they showed off their red prisoners for the cameras, the White cause was faltering. Corruption and unpopularity assailed their leader, Admiral Kolchak, who called himself the supreme ruler. Kolchak was never as strong as he looked.
The situation in Siberia was very confused. There was never any proper Bolshevik government and, in fact, any Kolchak government. The great majority of little towns and villages were so-called Greens. That is, they opposed both the communists and the Kolchak armies. Generally speaking, we wanted to be left in peace.
A trap door slowly opened. You know those Russian houses with cellars running underneath. And someone appeared. Oh, they said, they could see we were whites from our epaulets and everything. Oh, our saviors, our deliverers, here, have some cucumbers, some cabbage. But later on, when we were forced to retreat, the same people shot us in the back.
Even the foreign intervention was not as much help to the Whites as they had hoped. Organizations like the American Red Cross sent supplies, but Allied aid often ended up helping the wrong side, like one red soldier who lost his boots.
I ended up fighting barefoot. It's awful marching through woods like that, all prickly, feet covered in blood. But what can you do? Later we got our hands on one of Admiral Kolchak's stores, stuff he got from England.
Его снабжала Англия, English.
There were boots there, such good boots, strong, thick soles, hobnails and huge sizes. One of your soldiers must have been even taller than me. That's how I got my boots. It was the happiest day of my life. Thank heavens, no more fighting barefoot.
The Reds borrowed ideas as well as boots from their white enemies. Old-fashioned mounted units like these white Cossack horsemen were out of favor among military theorists, but they were fast, cheap, and terrifying. So the Reds set up their own cavalry army.
Partisan units started first, and then the party took over control of organizing it. We had a slogan, workers to horse. We got hold of horses and saddles and gradually began to build up our own cavalry units. The commander was Budyonny.
And so your humble servant joined the cavalry. When you go into an attack, I used to be in the infantry. We had to charge with our bayonets. It was terrifying. Even now I still shiver to think of it. But in a cavalry attack, you can feel another living thing beneath you, the horse. And somehow that keeps you calm. And if it's a good horse, then you can catch up with an opponent, and if you don't get in there first, you'll get cut down.
The Red Cavalry was formidable and glamorous. It became the enduring image of Red victory. By the summer of 1920, the Whites were in retreat. Delegates from all over the world came to Russia for the Third Communist International. There were now a host of small communist parties to congratulate Lenin on what was still the only successful socialist revolution. The star speaker was Trotsky.
The leader of the Red Army, the creator, in fact, of the Red Army, the conqueror of Kolchak, and he was a splendid speaker. I remember very vividly how he came once. We had a parade, and he came and talked to us, and we were all very young, and we were all very hungry. And this speech somehow influenced us very much, and I can only say that Trotsky was our idol. We were prepared to die for him.
The Red Army Trotsky created now numbered over 5 million men. Most of the white generals were dead or evacuated overseas. Only one remained, the Cossack general Wrangel, nicknamed the Black Baron. Wrangel commanded the last of the white forces. They were in the south. With them were thousands of civilians. They were hurrying towards the Crimea and the safety of a massive waterborne evacuation to Turkey. On the 4th anniversary of the October Revolution, in weather so cold the men had to stuff their shirts with moss, the last battle began.
At Perikop, there were terrible battles. 30,000 lay dead, all Reds. They'd attacked us day and night, non-stop. Non-stop. 30,000 they lost. We had no forces left anymore. All our strength was gone. Our troops wavered and fell back towards the Crimea.
I would like to make a comparison with Dunkirk. Of course, the ships were overloaded. There were a great number of people, the army and civilians had to be evacuated. And the ships, some of the ships were listing. Our ships particularly was listing. The water was just, as we pulled out, the water was just going a bit over the decks. But there were no panic, there were no stress. One could feel, even as a child, I felt that there was tension.
but there was no hysterical outcries. Only thing was emotional feeling that we are leaving Russia and we are leaving for something unknown.
We were standing on the quay. They'd stopped boarding people because the ship was so overloaded. As we stood there, a boat passed by, a minesweeper. Yes, it was a minesweeper. It was flying a big St. Andrew's flag, and on deck stood General Wrangel. The boat was moving very slowly, and General Wrangel was shouting through a horn. He was saying, "The time has come to evacuate. We're leaving for foreign lands. Nobody knows what awaits us. But anyone who wishes to stay, I bear them no grudges. I know myself how hard it is to leave your homeland." The minesweeper passed by, and we shouted, "Hurrah!"
George Novikov was one of 150,000 people General Wrangel evacuated from the Crimea. The Cossack Cemetery in Paris is the last resting place of a lost cause. George Novikov came to France as an exile. In Russia, the Reds had dealt the Whites a decisive defeat. For the rest of the empire, the battles were still to come. The Kronstadt naval base near Leningrad. In the spring of 1921, sailors mutinied. Their rebellion was crushed in a bloody and traumatic encounter. After Kronstadt, Russia became a true one-party state. The Civil War was over. People tried to rebuild their lives, but the economy was in tatters. Flyaway inflation meant money was worthless. In the cities, the working class disappeared as people went home to their villages. The Kronstadt revolt would become a powerful expression of this popular discontent.
Oh, 1920 Moscow. People were starving, snow everywhere, the trams had stopped. Rationing had been brought in for all the workers and office workers. Everybody would go off to work in the morning, dragging little sledges. On the way back, they were loaded with wood chips, fuel for their stoves. They had little iron stoves with pipes, which they poked through the window. It was so cold.
So one day I was getting the snow out to boil the kettle, and I found a crow, and it was frozen crow. So I brought it back, and my sister and I decided that if she plucked it, she knew how to pluck. If she plucked it and dressed it up properly, we could probably let it be, say that it was a chicken and sell it that way. And so I took it to the market. It had been powdered, it had been dressed up. The crow looked marvelous. And some commissar's wife gave me quite a lot of stuff for it. She gave me half a pound of lard and about 10 pounds of potatoes. I bargained like anything. So that was the way we lived.
To keep the cities from starving, iron detachments of party activists arrived in the countryside. They'd changed their party's name from Bolshevik to Communist, so the Bolsheviks, who promised land to the peasants, were now communists, taking their food by force. The villages did not submit without a struggle.
There were times of real hunger. All our food had gone. Anybody who had any grain left hid it away in the wood. They'd found out that grain requisitioning had already got to neighboring villages. So the men built a little hut in the woods nearby. They collected all the food we had left, all the grain, and hid it there in the little hut.
peasants were confused. At first, the Bolsheviks hadn't seemed too bad. But these communists, with their requisitioning gangs, were nothing but thieves and tyrants. The countryside resisted, at first with flails and pitchforks, later as real armies. The Civil War had ended. The Peasant War was just beginning.
Thousands of party people were set upon and killed by roaming bands of vengeful peasants. Lenin said, "We are barely holding on."
Every Saturday and Sunday we were out on grain requisitions, searching out stores of food. The local party representative had set out to meet us when he was ambushed. They killed him, stole all his papers, and let his horse go. A horse turned up carrying his dead body.
Years of war and requisitioning, then a terrible drought. This train evacuated 400 starving children from the Volga. These were the lucky ones. The famine killed 5 million. At Kronstadt, the sailors thought their revolution had been betrayed. This was the reason for the celebrated mutiny of 1921. They called for free speech and more democracy. Their demand? All power to the Soviets to rescue the Soviets from Communist Party control. They were armed and powerful. It was Trotsky, leader of the Red Army, who took the decision to attack the island fortress. He sent in the Civil War hero Tukhachevsky. Red soldiers went into battle against Red sailors. Their task was daunting.
It was already spring. The ice was beginning to melt. The water came up to our knees. But it was much worse for the infantry, who had to march ahead. The ice was melting, and in front of my very eyes, I can still picture it now, an entire unit of men just disappeared beneath the ice. And after a bloody battle, we finally took Kronstadt.
To the Red soldiers who crossed the ice, the sailors were guilty of unforgivable treachery. This film depicts heroic defenders of the revolution.
Life was like that. Today a comrade, tomorrow a traitor to the revolution. I've only ever had sympathy for people loyal to Soviet power. I had never sympathized with people who opposed it. Never.
This was the flash which lit up reality better than anything else. That was Lenin's reaction to Kronstadt. His response was a political clampdown. All other parties were banned. Inside his own party, dissident factions were outlawed. But he transformed his economic ideas. He used his personal authority to force through a controversial new economic policy. Food markets reopened as free trade was legalized, and the peasants appeared in town to sell their produce. The new economic policy, or NEP, was a welcome release from ration cards and requisitioning. But to many communists, NEP brought back the bad old days.
You could buy everything. They sold anything you wanted. There was sausage, boiled, fried, steamed. Maybe it was even dog meat. I don't know. We used to watch all the bourgeoisie, the ladies sailing by, showing off. There were tables put out for them in the park, a small park, the Hermitage it was called. It's still here in Moscow. People would gather there in the evening, play music, have a bit to drink.
There wasn't a scrap of food in the country. We were down to a quarter pound of bread per person. Then, suddenly they announced NEP. Cafes started opening, restaurants. Factories went back into private hands. It was capitalism. The papers were all quoting Lenin. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That's all very well, but in my eyes, what was happening was the very thing I'd struggled against.
It was just like perestroika. People don't understand now either. They have their doubts, wonder do we need it? But in those days, the situation was even more acute. I can remember the years 1921, 1922. We used to discuss the new economic policy for hours on end at party meetings. Most people supported Lenin. Others said he was wrong. Many even tore up their party cards.
NEP was a sensible response to Lenin's economic difficulties. It didn't owe much to Karl Marx. According to him, socialism simply couldn't apply to a backward economy like Russia's. In any case, the revolution had to be international. Marx gave no clues about what to do if you found yourself all on your own trying out socialism in one poor, backward, chaotic country.
And the empire was one country again. Tbilisi, capital of Georgia, 1,000 miles from Moscow on the other side of the Caucasus Mountains. Joined the Russian Empire in 1801, left it in 1918. Brought back in by force in 1921. During its brief period of independence, Georgia was run by a left-wing coalition. A delegation of leading Western socialists came on a visit to see the first elected socialist government in the world. Crowds turned out to hear Ramsay MacDonald, the British Labour leader. The British Army was here too, this Indian force among the last remainders of the foreign intervention. Expensive and ineffective, the intervention was abandoned. As the British fleet sailed away from Georgia, a small army of local volunteers was left to defend the country's independence.
Everybody was queuing to join up. Anybody who could use a rifle was enrolled as a soldier and sent off to the front. As I remember, about 300 people were killed just in the vicinity of one village alone. Our troops were cut off by the Reds and our army was forced to retreat.
I got up one morning, went out, and there they were. Red soldiers on horseback in those sort of tall helmets, riding along our street. And that was that. The town was quiet, peaceful, orderly. The soldiers had been told to leave the local people alone. All the terror and all that came later.
Joseph Stalin was the man responsible for sending the Red Army into his homeland. This is his mugshot from the Tsarist police files. As a non-Russian, he seemed the perfect choice for the job of Commissar for Nationalities in the Soviet government. In the summer of 1921, after the fighting was over, the Commissar for Nationalities came home to Georgia and addressed a meeting. Shalva Chantladze was there.
Some of the workers there got up and said, "We don't agree with you. We don't agree because we were running a political struggle here," they said. But all this killing and attacking our former comrades, the Social Democrats who set up the government here, well, we can't do that. Comrades sitting close by could see that Stalin was angry and spiteful. He said, "We made a bad job of turning Georgia over. We'll have to turn her over again."
The communists were all in favor of national self-determination, but they were more in favor of workers' power. In its name, Soviet rule was enforced in Georgia. The local party boss, Philip Maharadze, led the celebrations. He unveiled a victory statue of Lenin. But the Georgian communists found their comrades from Moscow high-handed and arrogant. Maharadze appealed to Lenin for support. By the time Trotsky took the salute at the parade marking the 5th anniversary of Soviet power, the arguments were heated. Lenin wasn't there to celebrate. He was too ill after a stroke. But he had a pile of letters from Georgia complaining about Stalin's behavior. At the Bolshoi Theater, there were many nationalities among the delegates who arrived to hear Stalin speak at a historic Congress of Soviets. It was December 1922.
Everybody had come in their national costume. They were all prepared to set up a federation. There were about 1,200 people there. They'd come from Belorussia, the Ukraine, from the 3 states in the Caucasus. We decided to take a vote. Stalin gave a speech that everybody was for joining together within the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics.
The foundation of the USSR recreated an empire almost the same as the one the Tsars had ruled. For Lenin, it should have been the summit of his life's work, but he was a sick man. And it's clear from his writings that he was worried.
The complete works of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, all 10 million words of them. One of his last letters was to the protesting Bolsheviks of Georgia. "Dear comrades, in this affair, I am entirely on your side. I'm horrified at Orjonikidze's arrogance and Stalin's criminal alliance with him." Thus Lenin declared war on bullying, bureaucracy, and chauvinism. It was far too late.
I got there and found all my party comrades already gathered. Some sort of secretary appeared. He seemed very upset about something. We all thought it was because he was ill. He went out, but after a couple of minutes he came back in. He said, "Comrades," and fell silent. There were tears in his eyes. We didn't understand anything until finally he said it. Lenin is dead. We were so shaken by it, we couldn't speak. Just sat there, couldn't move from the room. Somehow we knew that at that moment we all needed each other.
Lenin suffered a third and final stroke at his country house on the 21st of January 1924. Hundreds of local people accompanied his coffin as it began the journey to Moscow. He was loved, he was hated. But he had towered over the country he left behind. At the trade union house in Moscow, Lenin lay in state. The mourners included his sister Ulyanova, his widow Krupskaya, his secret police chief Dzerzhinsky, his general secretary Stalin. The entire party leadership confronting the question what to do now with the country they had inherited.
It was such bitter weather. Everybody froze, but they still queued to pay their last respects to Lenin. That's how much they loved this man, this leader. Ordinary, honest people, peasants, workers, intellectuals. They were all wiping the tears from their eyes as they lined up at Trade Union House to file past the coffin of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. It never occurred to me that anybody could take Lenin's place. There was a slogan printed in the papers: Lenin can only be replaced by the collective will of the party.
All this began on the very day the old leader died. Busts of Lenin, inkwells in the shape of his mausoleum, Lenin's face on cigarette packets. It got so out of hand that the Immortalization Commission stepped in with licenses to control the Lenin souvenir industry. It was the Immortalization Commission, too, which put his embalmed body on public display, the relic of an atheist saint. Lenin would have hated it, but every Soviet leader since has claimed to be acting in his name.
More than anything, we were frightened of Trotsky seizing power. Although now we know that that wasn't the main problem. In those days, Stalin was an unknown figure to us. People hadn't heard of him. I worked in the Kremlin, and I didn't know who Stalin was. And I was a Red commander.
In Soviet Georgia, people remember one last outburst of nationalist feeling, a socialist uprising in the summer following Lenin's death, bloodily suppressed by the secret police. Hundreds were held in this cellar in the mountain town of Telavi.
From what I can gather, that night they planned to execute 100 people. The prisoners were all undressed, made to stand in their underwear. After the execution, the bodies were thrown onto horse-drawn carts, just piled up. They were taken to a place called Gigo Hills. As the carts moved off, blood was dripping on the road. They left a trail of blood behind them. My father was head of investigation in the local police. 3 days before, he'd been relieved of his duties and arrested. That was on the Thursday. By the following Tuesday, he'd been executed. He was shot here, in that building. How did we find out he'd been shot? They just put a list up on the wall. That's how we found out.
When you chop wood, chips fly. One of Stalin's favorite sayings. Soviet people of all nationalities would soon learn what Georgians knew already. The lesson that blood must be spilt to drive a people along the road towards the shining future. That for Joseph Stalin, their country's famous son, the end would always justify the means.